Welcome back to the Progressive Podiatry Project. As always, I'm your host, Talisha Reeve, and thank you again for joining me. I love doing these podcasts and YouTube videos and all the episodes that we do. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. I have seen quite a large spike in subscribers, both on YouTube and also on the podcast platforms in the last few weeks, which is fantastic. So thank you. I'm hugely appreciative of all your support. And just while I'm here, a bit more of a global love and appreciation comment that I want to throw out to just the wider P3 community. I don't think I can really put it into words how appreciative I am of all of you that engage in the content, that reach out to me, the conversations that we have. And it means a lot that the work that we do here means a lot to you and is helping you in your clinical practice. And I love that the P3 platform is becoming more and more global. Like, for example, in this last week alone, I've spoken to clinicians from New Zealand, the UK, Ireland, America, and also Singapore. So that's in the last 5 days. So business week. And it's just the conversations that we have, the different projects I'm working on people with. It's just fantastic. And speaking of the international audience, I'm heading off again tomorrow to Japan for this will be the third trip for the P3 Podiatry Japan project. So I'll be away for about 2.5 weeks in Japan. We've got a number of workshops that we plan to do there. We've got the plantar fasciopathy rehabilitation masterclass, the live version of that we're running. And then it's a bit of a different spin on the functional rehabilitation of musculoskeletal pathologies workshop that I've been running in Australia, most recently in Albury, Wodonga, a little over a week ago. So I'm racking up the kilometres, there's no doubt about that. Am I tired? Yes. Am I loving it? Also yes. We're doing the rehab masterclass for plantar fasciopathy in Tokyo. Then it's a little bit of a global exercise prescription workshop that I'm running as well, which is tackling tib-post tendon dysfunction, arthritis, and Achilles tendinopathy. So the principles of rehab for those pathologies. And then they're also hosting a conference, which I'm doing 2 keynote presentations at, which will be fantastic. So one of the topics I'm talking about engaging clients in rehabilitation, so the motivational drivers that can really influence whether or not someone will or won't engage in our program, and what we can do as clinicians to help facilitate that process. And then I'm also speaking to how we can use our functional and objective assessments to guide our exercise prescription, so moving outside of just using them purely for diagnostics. So that should be really good. I'm really excited about this trip, and this time, it's only 12 hours until I fly out. Thus far, there's no COVID or broken bones that I've acquired, which I had leading into both trips last time, respectively. So anyway, that's my appreciation post. That's a little bit of an update on where the P3 platform is sitting in the global space at the minute. And today we're going to be talking about standardised care versus cookie cutter protocols, where we can standardise care versus where we should or shouldn't be cookie cuttering. We shouldn't be cookie cuttering, by the way. So it's a fine line that we can walk. So standardised care, there are certain things in our clinical practice that it really pays to standardise, so we can ensure that we're delivering consistent, high quality care across the board. But again, it is a fine line for us to walk between standardising too much, because if we standardise too much to have everyone's treatment and the consultations the same, then we are cookie cuttering, and then that removes the individualisation, which, as we know, if we're not individualising our rehabilitation and management plans, then we're likely selling ourselves and our clients short of achieving successful treatment outcomes. So let's get into it. The Progressive Podiatry Project, here to share knowledge, insights and information for you to improve your clinical practice and, most importantly, help you help your clients. So one thing I do want to say before we launch right into this topic is I am talking or speaking to this topic through the lens of musculoskeletal podiatry. So there are many things in healthcare that it very much does pay to have very rigid protocols. But in the musculoskeletal and exercise rehabilitation space, I feel that it's probably not as appropriate to sort of have those really strict protocols. And that's what we're going to be exploring throughout today's episode. So again, looking through the lens of that. So there's many other elements in podiatry and just allied health and medicine in general where, again, protocols can apply and they're certainly useful, but musculoskeletal lens. So the reason I wanted to speak to this today was there's been a few articles and blog posts that I've put out recently that has been talking to the topics of having our systems and procedures in place. And then another area where this came up was when I was actually in Albury delivering the functional rehab of musculoskeletal pathologies workshop, which, side note, if you are interested, I am in the process of organising that 2-day live musculoskeletal rehab workshop in Sydney, Melbourne, hopefully Newcastle and Brisbane. So if you want to register your interest for the live workshop, head to progressivepodiatryproject.com/FRMP live, and you can register your interest there, select the city that you're interested in, and depending on the amount of interest that we get, then that will kind of speed up the process of where we're prioritising things in our schedule. Anyway, so one of the questions that came about within the workshop was we were exploring some of the best practice guidelines for a couple of different musculoskeletal pathologies, plantar fasciopathy, Achilles tendinopathy, to name a few. And there was one question that came up from one of the attendees where it was, well, why are you sort of running through all of these different exercises and all of these different tests? Because in the best practice guide, they have an example program that we can follow, where if you're not familiar with it, it's based on the 2021 Dutch multidisciplinary guideline on Achilles tendinopathy. So basically, it gives you a starting point, and essentially the recommendation is to start with isotonic exercises at 4x15 repetitions. And if the pain exceeds 5 out of 10 on the VASP, then you regress this to 45-second isometric holds. Then if the person theoretically can perform the 45-second isometric holds and the pain is less than 5, progress them up to the isotonic exercises. If the pain is under 5, then you progress to adding weight, 4x6 repetitions. And then if their pain is less than 5, then you increase to plyometric exercises. Then if the pain is less than 5, then it's a gradual return to sport. So yes, it's a really good sort of example framework of how you may progress someone through. But then the question I posed back was, okay, well, what happens if they can't do the isotonic exercises and you regress them back to the isometric exercises? What happens then? But then also, what isotonic or isometric exercise are you prescribing? What dosage variables are you going to be using? What information are you using, aside from the fact that they have Achilles tendinopathy, to guide your exercise prescription? Because as we know from some of the other episodes that we've covered, there's a multitude of ways, 9 in particular, that we can vary our exercise prescription as far as exercise selection and dosage goes. So quite a large number of variables, and they're all of the things that we need to have an understanding of if we are to create these individualized programs. Because again, even the best practice guidelines, they're essentially that. They're a guideline. So they guide the clinical pathway or the clinical decision-making process. They don't dictate it. So that's where the conversation kind of went in there. And I will jump back to that in a minute. So if we dial it right back, why it's important to have a standardisation of our care. So it is very important for ensuring that we're delivering high quality care to our patients, especially as if we have a clinic that is growing. So if we're documenting, and this is from an article that I wrote a few weeks ago, where we always should, if there's anything that you do in the clinic more than once, write it down and document it, because then that becomes a process. If it's just a once-off, then it's a once-off. Anything more than once, document it, create a process for it, because one, if you get busy as a clinician and then you need to outsource or get someone else to do the work, delegate the work or the responsibilities, then they have a process to follow that will ensure that it's keeping to the standard that you performed it at, or it's just done correctly. So if the clinic is busy and growing, or if you have staff turnover, so if you have a new staff member, whether or not it's a clinician or an administrative staff member, then we need that to onboard them so they know what they're doing correctly. Because if we sort of scoot out a little bit or zoom out a little bit, that's one of the things that really can influence and either positively or negatively impact how someone, an employee, performs in your business. The onboarding process really sets the stage for how someone will progress through the business. And when I say progress through, will they stay, get more invested in the business, perform better in the business, and become a key player in the business? Or are they going to disengage and eventually remove themselves from the business? Now, onboarding, if it's a very poor onboarding process or it doesn't exist, that even if it's a great employee who is theoretically perfectly suited to your clinic, a very poor onboarding process, one, helps speed up the process of disengagement, because if someone doesn't have clarity and certainty about what their role is, what their responsibilities are, how they perform things, even just that level of underlying stress from that, it can compound very quickly. It can disengage a person very quickly, and then they can actually leave the business very quickly. Okay, so that's probably speaking more so to the employee experience. Now, that's getting a little bit off track, so I'll reel myself back in and we'll focus on things through the musculoskeletal lens as far as exercise rehab goes. So first things first is probably, well, we're a little way into it, but let's say first things first. Cookie cutter protocols versus standardized care. So what do I mean by a cookie cutter protocol? So cookie cutter protocols are typically when a clinician will be either through the assessment or the treatment process, but essentially they're following a set of predefined or predetermined steps and implementing that regardless of the person, and running with the assumption or the hope that everyone will respond the same or quite similar. So think your standardised, separate those two. So think our rigid orthoses prescriptions that we may use, our even just the way a consultation runs regardless of the person, or might be pre-printed exercise sheets issued en masse, so it doesn't matter if you're 8 years old or 80 years old. And when that happens, especially with those pre-printed exercise sheets, that is often when we see a clinician treating a pathology versus, or as opposed to treating a person with a pathology. So it's removing that individualisation of care, which, with the example I was using just before about talking to the Achilles tendinopathy multidisciplinary guidelines, that's it, a guide. So with the example program that they put through, that's essentially a collation of where a lot of people that sort of regress to the mean would likely see a positive response to following that. But then if we zoom out and have a look at how everyone responds, there would be a great deal of outliers. So you'll have some people that pathway may significantly overdose them, or it may significantly underdose some other people as far as restoring functional capacity. So it's a guide. Now, what we need to be able to do is we can use that as a little bit of a framework, but again, that individualisation needs to come into it. So determining what their starting load tolerance is, what suitable exercises may exist that are in line with that capacity, and then what dosage can we apply to help improve their capacities. So essentially, when it's a cookie cutter protocol or process, it fails to consider the complexity and individuality of human health and just the human experience, really. So on the other hand, when we're talking about standardised care, it's when we have some elements of our clinical processes set the same, but it's essentially, it creates a framework. So it allows for flexibility and adaptability within that framework. So I think the most important thing to realise or understand is, with the understanding the difference between the two, is it's essentially that we can provide consistently high quality care without it being identical care. So you can have an identical standard of care, but the identical treatment, it doesn't exist. It won't be an identical treatment. So it's not just the Achilles tendinopathy guideline where that's where a guideline exists. If we think 2021 was a great year for guidelines coming out, so we had the Plantar Heel Pain Best Practice Guideline that was published as well, which is fantastic. And if you're not familiar with that paper, it is a great read. I will have it linked in the Spotify and YouTube descriptions with more info. It might trickle down into some of the other podcast platforms, but essentially if you go onto the P3 platform, we've got it plastered there. We've done so many posts on it, but anyway, with the Plantar Heel Pain Guideline, this was a really good example as well, because that guideline, it did incorporate some elements of individualisation. So they have the do's and then the decides. So the do's for people who are presenting with plantar heel pain: education, strapping and stretching. And then the decides is load management, other orthomechanical interventions if they're required. And then they also provided a rough timeline. So attempt the core approach for roughly 4 weeks. If someone doesn't respond, then you may consider shockwave therapy for a number of weeks. If they don't respond to that, then you may consider orthoses. So it's a great framework because it is evidence informed and it gives a little bit of, well, quite a lot of clarity that maybe didn't exist before as far as what your treatment options may be and the timing of those treatment interventions. However, again, it's a guideline. There are some people that, let's say we're talking about strapping or we're talking about the stretching exercises. For some people with plantar fasciopathy, the strapping, they may need a fat pad strapping if it's more of a compressive driven pathology versus just the standard lodi or tensile plantar fascia strapping. So that's just one area where there may be nuance. And then there might be some people that they don't need strapping at all. And then with the stretching exercises, we may have someone with a very highly reactive plantar fascia that the stretching will overdose them. We may have some other people that say it's a runner and they do have plantar fasciopathy. The stretching exercises may provide little to no benefit to them where they're sitting in the functional capacity spectrum. So again, it's quite a little bit, it's a really good guide to start you off, but then I'm of the opinion that we should probably be sitting more in the decides for all of those elements. So I think for and this is where that differentiation between standardisation comes into play. So I feel, when I'm talking about this in the plantar fasciopathy rehab masterclass, either the live version or the online version that we have, that's one thing that I talk about. So instead of having the do's and the decides, I think what I talk about in this is I think we should assess and address all of the elements. So we should be assessing and addressing everyone's load history, their footwear, what their activity history is. Well, that sort of kind of falls into load history, but load history can also encapsulate activities of daily living, occupational history, and so on. We should be considering their footwear. So it's assess and address, and that's where, again, that framework comes in. So my framework for plantar heel pain is essentially following it's basically got a criteria of all of those points to prompt me to ask the questions to explore all of those elements. So that's where you can have a standardized procedure or approach. So the standardization component is making sure that the clinicians are prompted to ask the questions relevant to all of those elements that may be helping drive or maybe driving someone's plantar heel pain presentation. So that's a framework, because I do feel that the do's and decides, with the do's, for some clinicians, if they're new to managing plantar heel pain or they sort of haven't really had enough time to reflect on their clinical practice, then that they may read that literature and then that protocol may just, it's not a protocol, that guideline may become their new protocol, which can still fall short of that individualisation of care, if that makes sense. So essentially between the two best practice guidelines that I've been discussing, so the take-home message here is that the best practice guidelines are fantastic, and they can, if you take the time, they can help you reflect on your clinical practice as far as what am I doing in the clinic, as far as my assessment and treatment management pathways are in relation to or in comparison to what best practice recommendations are. And so we should be reflecting and adjusting our treatment pathways and our processes accordingly in line with best practice. So they can help guide us away from those sort of strict cookie cutter protocols. But again, it can be easy for some clinicians to fall into that trap of just replacing an existing protocol with what the guide is recommending. But we do need to be very mindful of not falling into that trap of just replacing that. We still need to be asking those questions and performing the functional assessments and gathering that information so we can individualise within that framework. So this is why we basically came up with the movement prescription blueprint. So that is a free rehab resource for you. If you head to progressivepodiatryproject.com/blueprint, you can download that there. So essentially what that is it's the workbook that comes with pretty much all of the online courses, but you can use it just as a standalone resource. And I think at last check, so we launched version 2, I launched version 2 earlier in the year, and we're almost at 1,000 downloads. So if you can just, if you are interested in it, download it, share it with your friends, or get your friends to download it and get us over that 1,000K mark. 4 figures sound sexy. So if you can get that, that would be really handy. But the feedback from the blueprint has been amazing. Just essentially, there is a prompt and also a treatment planning tool for you to essentially prompt you to ask those ask the questions so you can gather the information so you can create those individualise exercise and rehabilitation management plans. So asking your clients what are their goals, exploring any of their psychobehavioural barriers. So a couple of cues for you to pick up on if there's anything else that might be driving their pathology or things that may prompt you to alter your management approach or your treatment narratives. So it just helps guide you through that process from the conversations with patients, identifying the goals, identifying barriers, and then honing it down into the exercise selection and the exercise prescription. But anyway, that's a free resource for you. If you want it, grab it. If not, that's fine. So hopefully that paints a little bit of a picture as far as the distinction between cookie cutter and standardisation. To wrap things up, today's a short and sweet episode, which you probably appreciate. Hopefully I've been to the point. But essentially, okay, so what can be standardised versus individualised? This is where we have our standardised framework, the things that are theoretically the same whenever, it doesn't matter who walks through the door, it should be roughly the same. And then the individualisation within that framework. So management frameworks, that is something that can be standardised, but it allows for individualisation. So management frameworks, the blueprint's a great example. So with this, it is a framework. So some clinicians use it as their musculoskeletal assessment because it's got little gaps in there, not gaps, sections within the blueprint for your functional tests, for your objective tests, for your subjective history taking. So essentially, the standardisation component of this is prompts to gather the pieces of information. So every patient might not be worded the same, but every patient will have all of those elements explored. It might, for one patient, it may be, no, that doesn't apply to me. Then it's a no, it doesn't need to go any further than that, but it's still being considered. Other people, let's say it's a psychobehavioural component of their movement prescription blueprint, that may be quite a lengthy conversation because there might be quite a few elements that are driving or impacting that person. So for two different people, one, the answer may be no. For someone else, it might be a 15-minute conversation. But the standardisation that is here is it's being considered and assessed and addressed, if possible, for the individual. Same with their tissue tolerance, same with their activity history. So that can be standardised. Now, and then again, the individualisation that comes with that. So then next from that is diagnostic criteria and treatment triggers. So this is if we've got someone, say, they're coming in with running related leg pain, and then based on our assessment and we identify there's a potential that there may be a stress fracture present. So we've gone through a framework of an assessment, but then, okay, we've identified something that's relatively a high risk pathology. So it may be a low risk or a high risk fracture, but a fracture is more of a higher risk pathology that we deal with. So we can have a standardized treatment trigger. So this may be, okay, sending off for diagnostic imaging, getting immobilized or get offloading. So again, that the offloading or the immobilization, so the deloading essentially to the minimal effective dose. So the deloading, that may be standardized if we're suspicious of a stress fracture or a fracture, acute fracture. That may be standardized, but then how much we deload may be individualized based on the individual's presentation, the bone that's suspected to be involved, the activity history, not the activity history, the activities that may be triggering this. So if you have someone who they can walk, it's a relatively low risk stress fracture, you may just have them in a stiff-soled shoe with a 4-foot rocker, where on crutches. If it's someone where it may be, say, a navicular stress fracture, and you're quite concerned and we need to send them for an MRI, then it may be a moon boot. So the standardization is the deloading, the individualization is how we go about that. Then another thing that is very much needs to be standardized, and this is where the previous articles that I wrote stemmed off from, is the documentation and record keeping. We should always be documenting basically everything, and then the individualization is the information that we're putting down that's relative to the patient. So we should have standardized procedures for how we document, how we keep our patient records. And then also another thing that can be standardized quite well with that little bit of individualization is even just the patient onboarding. So I mentioned earlier that we have employee onboarding, but patient onboarding. So the information that they get sent when they first make an appointment with your clinic, and it can just be those little things, which also feeds into a positive patient experience. But it might be, are they sent a confirmation email? Are they sent a confirmation SMS? Are they provided with some information on the nightmare parking situation that you may have at your clinic? So just the information that they're provided, and then the forms that they fill out. So that's a standardization. And then some of the information may be individualized to the patient. Like if it's someone that they're referred to your clinic with an EPC, then there may be a different set of documents that are required. So there may be a standardized procedure based on that trigger of them informing you that they have that particular referral, or it might be NDIS, or it might be private health, or whatever it is. So there may be, when that individual information comes in, it may trigger another procedure that has been standardized based on that. And then clinical safety measures, and just even our healthcare principles and behavioural principles. So essentially the Podiatry or Allied Health Code of Ethics. Follow that, standardise it. So they're the standardised elements. And then I have spoken to a few of the individualised elements. So the treatment plans. So we've gone through our standardised information gathering, and then based on the individualised information, we come up with our individualised treatment plan. So the individualised elements of this treatment plan, it may be the footwear recommendations that we suggest. It might be the exercises we prescribe. It might be the educational elements that are relevant to that patient. It might be discussing if there's any case conferences that might need to happen with other healthcare providers, or collaboration with other healthcare providers, or referrals. And lastly, which is very important, is identifying the patient goals and their priorities and how that will impact your treatment. And again, all of this will help you formulate your individualized management plans. So hopefully you've got a lot out of that today. Short and sweet episode. As always, I would love to hear your feedback. So if you've got anything, you can email it through to p3podiatry@gmail.com, or depending on what platform that you're listening to this on, you can just drop a comment. And I would very, very much be appreciative if you could leave us a thumbs up or leave us a review, depending on the podcast platform that you're listening to this on. It's been great. I'll catch you next time. Cheers.